All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Victoria Law. Victoria is the editor of the zine Tenacious, Art and Writings from Women in Prison. She is the co-founder of Books Through Bars, as well as the author of Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, which you can find at resistancebehindbars.org. Victoria, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so Victoria, you have a great piece currently up at Truth Out on how states are drastically cutting the budgets to prisons, but not really cutting the actual populations of prisons. So tell us all about it.
So several states have realized that prisons are costly, and it costs a lot to incarcerate people. In some states, it costs, like $40,000 a year to incarcerate a single person, and that is a single healthy person, not someone who is, say, elderly or has medical issues. And this is largely because state prison populations have exploded over the last 40 years, largely because of mandatory sentencing. And the idea that, to maintain law and order, you need to lock up more and more people for smaller and smaller offenses. And as states are trying to address budget gaps and the fact that they don't have money for other services such as education or, like drug treatment or employment programs, they're looking to close budget gaps by closing prisons, but they're not at the same time looking at these policies that send so many people to prison and figuring out ways to not have so many people in prison. So they're shifting populations from, say, 2 prisons and packing them into 1 prison. So we see this in California. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, and like I was just about to ask. You write about how in California, these prisons there, and this is not just a California problem, but specifically you focus on California at the beginning of the article, of where these prisons are at close to 200% capacity of what they're legally supposed to be. Correct?
Yes. Yes, California's prisons are hugely overcrowded. In 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court actually ruled that the California Department of Corrections in the state of California had to reduce their prison population to 137.5% capacity. At the time, the California prison population was, grossly over that, and that was the Supreme Court's ruling saying that the severe overcrowding in California's prison system was unconstitutional. It was cruel and unusual punishment. The state wasn't able to provide medical care. In many prisons, people were being housed in gymnasiums and cafeterias and places and hallways and places that weren't meant to be, to be housing areas or cells or dorm rooms. And to comply with that, instead of looking at some of these policies like 3 strikes and you're out and mandatory drug laws, to see where they could begin reducing the prison population, the State Department of Corrections and the state started shifting people from prisons to local jails where they had less access to programming and less opportunities, say, to gain some sort of skill that would help them upon release, say, like drug treatment or, some sort of vocational skill or even being able to get their GED or some sort of education while inside. And at the same time, the State Department of Corrections also started looking at shifting the women's prison population into a smaller number of women's prisons, so converting one prison, the Valley State Prison in Chowchilla, California, into a men's prison, shifting men from the overcrowded men's prison into Valley State, and then shifting the remaining, the 1,000 or so women in Valley State to the women's prison across the street, which was already overcrowded. So they're actually not releasing people to comply with this Supreme Court order. They're just juggling them around so that it looks like there's less overcrowding.
Unbelievable. And what kills me about it even is the Supreme Court order is not even don't get to 100% capacity, get to 135% capacity. It's okay, it's fine being, beyond capacity, but even to me that to me is absolutely absurd. So obviously these prisons are not designed to house as many people as they are currently being designed, and we're doing there's budget cuts on all types of state levels. What exactly does that mean for the prisoners? What is that? When they're not only the fact that they're stacked on top of each other and living in inhumane conditions. To talk a little about the conditions and what that actually means when these prisons are so vastly overpopulated.
Well, what it means then is that you have, for a cell that perhaps is designed to hold 2, perhaps, for the bigger ones, 4, if you really want to, start a powder keg going inside the prison, are now holding 7 or 8 women. So I'm, specifically looking at, the people from Valley State Prison who were moved over to the Central California Women's Facility across the street. So there's now 8 women to a cell that originally was designed to hold 2, and then if you put in 2 bunk beds, you can hold 4, and it will be a very tense situation. And so suddenly now you have 8 people in a room, 7 or 8 people in a room. So that's looking at, having an explosive situation right there. At the same time, people have less access to programming. At Valley State Prison, there were a number, I think there were something like 56 different self-help or therapeutic groups to address some of the issues that women came in with, such as substance abuse problems or dealing with past trauma, past violence, or past abuse problems, or, trying to maintain contact with their children and navigating what parenting from prison looks like. And almost all of these programs were cut. So these were programs that really didn't cost the Department of Corrections or the state any money because they were being facilitated by the women inside who got some training in how to facilitate this, and these were cut. So then this also means that in the long run, you have all these people who are going to come out of prison without any sort of skills or anything or training that they can fall back on to say, well, I have a huge gap in my life, in terms of having been in prison X number of years, but I've gained this skill or I've gained this, ability to navigate this, and I'm not going to fall back into, some of the same patterns that led me back to prison before, whether it be a substance abuse problem or, getting involved in relationships that aren't so healthy for me that might lead me back to prison. And one thing that's important to note is that in California and also in Illinois, which is also closing one women's prison and stuffing the remaining women inside, is that both Department of Corrections for the states have said that there are a number of women inside prisons that actually don't need to be in the prisons. They are, for the most part, nonviolent. They've shown themselves to, not have caused a lot of problems inside the prison. They've, and they would actually be better off back in their communities getting support services from outside than having states spend $40,000 or more per year locking them up inside prisons and then spending however much money, they spend on what I guess we would call collateral, consequences, which means if they have children, which the majority of women in prison do, if their children are in foster care, that's another, expense that the state has to pay, housing children in foster care, which isn't factored into that original $40,000.